The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Welcome back to another episode of Titans of Nuclear. I'm Sarah, and today I'm joined by Will Shackel, the founder of Nuclear for Australia. Will's a part of our series highlighting young, influential leaders in the nuclear industry. Will, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on today, Sarah.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So I want to start off by just getting to know you before we talk about all the great work that you've been doing lately. So tell us about yourself. Did you grow up in Australia?
Yes, I did grow up in Australia. So I'm Will Shackel. I'm a 17-year-old from a little-known Australian city called Brisbane, which is in Queensland for anyone who's familiar with it. I've had an interesting experience. I was born in Sydney, Australia, which people are probably a bit more familiar with. I lived in Chicago for a few years in the United States and then came back to Sydney before finally ending up here in Brisbane. And recently I've become interested in the issue of nuclear energy. Our government, the Australian government, has a deeply rooted opposition to nuclear energy. And as a result of that, I decided to start Australia's first youth-led campaign for the ban on nuclear energy to be lifted, called Nuclear for Australia.
So you mentioned you're still in school. Did you learn anything at all about nuclear through school, or has this always just been kind of a passion project on the side?
Well, I guess when your country has a ban on nuclear energy, it's very unlikely you're going to hear anything about it in the education system. And that's certainly my experience. I'm a year 11 student, and there have been very few, if any, mentions of nuclear energy. And there's certainly nothing about nuclear energy currently in the curriculum, which I think is a real shame, especially when, as a country, we're looking at being increasingly involved in the nuclear industry. And whilst we still have that ban on nuclear power, you look at things like AUKUS, the nuclear submarines. We need to make sure that Australian children, Australian students are educated in nuclear science and aware of that the industry even exists and what nuclear energy is, if we want to have those skills for the future, which will be required for those submarines, and also if one day the ban on nuclear energy was to be lifted. So look, I think then you probably get the question is, how did I even hear about nuclear energy and why did I become interested?
Yeah, exactly.
Really, I think, so I didn't get that at school. I would say, I guess with the Google and the internet, you get access to a lot more information these days. And I guess just by chance, I came across nuclear energy on the internet. I saw some of Michael Schellenberger's talks. Clearly, he had a lot of traction in this, and I decided to investigate it a bit further. I think I did an assignment on it in year 6, read some articles about it, thought it was interesting, and was simply very, very confused why Australia would oppose, from my perspective, what was almost a perfect solution, a technology that was able to solve both issues, the climate and energy crisis. And I think after that, last year in grade 10, I did an assignment on it again. And that school holidays, I had some time to spare and decided to put that time into starting this campaign.
Yeah, that's awesome. So tell me a little bit about those assignments, or maybe even the piece of research that really turned that light on in your brain where you realized you wanted to learn a lot more about this.
Look, it's very hard to pinpoint where that happened. It was all a bit random. For me, I think what I would say is I was particularly intrigued about the debate we're having in Australia about the cost of nuclear energy. And there's a certain report, it's called the Gen Cost Report. And I came across that in this assignment I did in year 10, which was an assignment for commerce. And I could not find a definitive answer on whether nuclear energy is indeed the most expensive form of energy. And I was simply baffled that that was the excuse that Australia had for having a ban on the technology and not even considering it, especially when there are so many countries around the world that for decades have invested and supported nuclear energy. And I just didn't get why the situation was different in Australia. So without having that definitive conclusion and information, I guess it sparked my curiosity and was sort of a catalyst for the inquiry and investigation I am now doing.
And do you have any like mentors, friends, or family members that are interested in the same thing that you can kind of bounce ideas off of and learn more from?
Well, in terms of family, contrary to what many people will say on Twitter, my parents are not members of the nuclear energy industry. And I don't know why people instantly assume that. My parents have got nothing to do with nuclear energy. I'm not sure why they would, given that they, like me, live in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of mentors, I've been very fortunate. I quite early on, and you would see this over my social media accounts, Nuclear for Australia. To form my stance, and this was, during those school holidays where I had that time to burn when I was starting up this campaign, I reached out to people across the world, experts who are really respected in this field, and just asked them lots of questions about it, about nuclear energy. And I tried to get different perspectives on it to form my opinions, because clearly as a 17-year-old, it is a bit inaccessible as an issue, especially when there's not much information. So I reached out to lots of people, and over time I've accumulated lots of connections, especially with experts around the world, and they've been able to really support what I'm doing. And I'm really fortunate to be in a group of people in Australia who support nuclear energy, a series of experts who unfortunately their voices get ignored in the public a lot of the time, but I've been able to have their support. They've supported me, provided me the information that they often don't get to share. And I've had the real privilege of giving a platform to that information that they share with me. So I'm very lucky in that regard about the people who have been so willing and generous mentoring me and supporting me on my nuclear journey.
Yeah, that's awesome. And before we talk a little bit more about all of these platforms that you're active on, let's back it up and talk some more about how you started founding Nuclear for Australia. How did that all come together? How did you decide on the branding and what it was all going to be about and all that good stuff?
I think it's probably quite obvious. It was all a bit random. I don't think there's much intention behind it, and I was just going off my gut at that point, and it's probably why in the start I didn't execute stuff very well. I was using basically just Canva. My whole campaign was based on Canva, which is actually an Australian company, by the way, and just regurgitating information, sharing it with people. I guess in terms of the branding, is quite obvious for me. Nuclear was green, therefore my branding must be green. And that was, I think, what I thought was a spark of brilliance. But mm-hmm. I think it's sort of worked that implicit connotation that I can build through that. But I would say I'm not receiving that much professional support. So I've had to navigate this on my own and use my own intuition to work out what's best. And it started, I think, on Instagram. I did a few posts and some videos using some school equipment they started to get traction. I DM'd a prominent journalist in Australia saying, could I have an interview on your program? He said yes. And from there, I guess this has all happened as a result. And I guess I've been very fortunate that I had that initial supporter who was able to give me that platform to share with people my passion for nuclear energy, so they became aware of my campaign and the petition and all the work that I'm doing. And now I guess it's just grown. Over time, I've had more and more support to help navigate these decisions. So now I'm in a position where, well, I'm probably in a much better position, I would say.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you've been kind of learning by doing for the most part. And as a young founder, what kind of has been your guiding lesson or way of thinking so far?
Look, that's a very difficult question, actually. I would probably just say that in terms of the decisions I make, to just be confident in them, because I think it's really easy as a young person, especially when you're up against it on an issue that, you know, the government of Australia vehemently opposes. It can honestly be quite scary and intimidating taking a stance on it. And, you know, I've really copped it on social media by coming out in support of nuclear energy, and I've had to make sacrifices. But I think for me, what's really guided how I've done things is just having confidence in myself, reminding myself that, you know, people do support me and that people are behind me. They might not express it publicly, but that I do have backers and support. And I think that's really provided me the confidence to do what I do on social media. Even it's, you know, even with filming videos for social media, that was not something I think I would be doing, filming myself a year ago, because it's quite intimidating, at least for me. I don't like the idea of filming myself, and it seems a bit obnoxious, I think, until you do it and you realize, well, I guess that it's not really that bad, and it's probably the net benefit of it is probably much greater than any embarrassment you might feel standing in public with a phone in front of you.
Right.
That's the other thing that's a bit interesting that I've experienced.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about all of your work on social media. You're on a lot of platforms. So tell us a bit about where we can find you and kind of what you feel right now is your most powerful platform, where you're getting the most traction and having the most productive conversations around nuclear.
Yeah, so I'm pretty much on every social media platform. Nuclear for Australia has an account on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. And that they all have, I would say, different audiences. So I cater different content to different audiences, knowing that, you know, there's different age demographics, different people have different politics depending on each platform, which has been something really interesting, I think, to navigate. What I would say in terms of the most successful one, I think it's interesting. In terms of converting to petition signatures, which is my current incentive at the moment, because I run a petition at nuclearforaustralia.com/petition to legalise nuclear energy, it's probably Twitter, because you can, or X as it's now known, because you can integrate the links into it. But it's actually been quite surprising that TikTok, I've been able to achieve the greatest reach. And I think it's interesting because that's a platform with a predominantly young audience. And I think the message that I convey, what I would hope is a really pragmatic and common sense message. Clearly it's resonating, and I've had great traction on TikTok. You know, quite a few of those videos have got in excess of 10,000 views. One of them has, I think it's over 130,000 views. And that's
wow.
just simply unheard of for me. And well, it was really interesting because that video was about the impact that wind turbines have on the natural environment, which for a lot of people outside of Australia, they might think, oh, well, Australia, you've got one of the greatest land masses, and your density of people to land, the ratio, whatever, must be so incredibly low that it doesn't impact you. But I think that's been something really interesting to witness in the nuclear debate, is that to a certain extent, and I don't oppose renewables, my message is that we should keep all options on the table, but the message that nuclear is incredibly energy dense and doesn't require the same land footprint is really powerful in Australia when you consider the impacts that energy developments have on agricultural land, forests, and precious natural land and Indigenous communities. And that's, I think, something that I've been able to capitalize on. And, it resonated in that video, which had in excess of 100,000 views.
Yeah, and now that we're talking a little bit more about your nuclear knowledge, let's get into some of your messaging also behind nuclear and start off with a big question. Why does Australia need to lift the ban on nuclear energy?
Okay, so there's quite a few things I could say about this, because I just don't think that Australia's nuclear energy ban makes any sense. I think the first thing I would say is nuclear energy positions itself as a near perfect solution for Australia. Unlike the fossil fuels Australia currently relies on, nuclear energy is clean. It has the lowest greenhouse gas emissions of any energy source, and it is safe. It's the second safest form of energy generation. And unlike renewables, nuclear energy is reliable. It has the highest capacity factor of any energy source. And really importantly, it's proven. Nuclear energy has been able to successfully transition countries such as France and to a low carbon grid. And that's something that renewables have not been able to do, except if, you consider hydro. And that's something that's really important for Australia, because my generation should not be taking on the risk of a renewable-centric plan failing, because that could be catastrophic, not only in terms of the impacts of the energy crisis and how that would exacerbate that with, the lights going out, but also the climate crisis, which, clearly has quite profound impacts on Australia. If you look at bushfires and all of these other natural disasters, which Australians have had to become all too familiar with. But I think the main thing with Australia's nuclear energy ban is it just does not make any sense. And there are so many contradictions in Australian government policy, it's not even funny. Like, for instance, Australia has a nuclear reactor already. It's at Lucas Heights. It's a research reactor 30 kilometres from the Sydney CBD. So when people say, oh, nuclear energy is not safe, Australia won't be able to manage the waste, well, we already do successfully manage a nuclear reactor, and we're renowned around the world for being able to do that with our nuclear expertise. We've got 400 people with PhDs managing that reactor. It's simply incredible. And Australia is at the cutting edge of many solutions, in particular for managing nuclear waste. Then there's the issue of AUKUS. And for people who are unfamiliar with that, it's, really important for Australia. The government's just is investing, I think, in excess of 300 billion Australian dollars into that for our nuclear submarines. Then there's a huge contradiction that the government is willing to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in floating nuclear reactors, and they're perfectly legal, but land-based nuclear reactors are completely illegal and something that the government has a problem with. That just simply makes no sense. And you also have to think about it from a waste aspect. Apparently, one of the government's issues is with high-level waste. Well, they've just, in signing up to the nuclear submarine program, to AUKUS, they've confirmed that they're going to have to manage the high-level waste here in Australia. So they're fine from the waste from floating nuclear reactors in the submarines. Why aren't they fine with the same waste, albeit there are some differences, from land-based nuclear reactors? And it goes on and goes on. The last thing I'd say that just makes no sense to me, and this came up in a response to a letter I wrote to our Prime Minister, and this was from, admittedly, a department official. But in that letter, the government said that they serve to reiterate the role that nuclear energy can play globally in the net zero transformation. So if it's right for the rest of the world, and they recognise the ability it has to transition countries to net zero around the world, why isn't it right in Australia? And why would you put a ban on it? is my question. And it's something the government has not been able to answer to date.
Yeah, it sounds like there are a lot of contradictions in what you've talked about so far. How did this ban originally even come about?
Well, Australia's nuclear energy ban was never a good piece of policy. Literally, it was debated for 10 minutes in the late 1990s in Australian Parliament, and it was basically a political trade-off or compromise for a tax policy called the Goods and Services Tax in Australia. So it was never a good piece of policy. Unfortunately, it was supported by the government of the day because, it was a political compromise. But I think that context is really important, that, the ban was never good policy. My generation certainly never had a say on it. Australians have never had a say on it, but we've been locked out of a technology that could potentially really benefit us. And, I agree with many when they say that it's anti-democratic to rule out a technology like that, when we should be having all options on the table in addressing the climate and energy crisis. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and we've touched on these contradictions. There's also a lot of misconceptions about nuclear that you've touched on a little bit so far as well. When you were originally starting to learn about nuclear, did you have a misconception that you had to overcome? Or if not, and you were starting with a clean slate, what's the most popular one that you often talk about with people?
Look, I think I started off on a clean slate. I hadn't been exposed to the misinformation that many past generations, older generations to mine, have been. And I think that's a general trait for young Australians, is because they receive no education in the education system about nuclear, because they don't hear about it to the same extent in pop culture, that we're all relatively new to it. The thing I think I have had to spend a lot of time getting people's heads around is the issue of nuclear waste, because apparently, because everyone sees it as a major issue, but what about the waste? It's not an issue. Chris Kiefer, he's in Australia actually as we speak, and he said in an interview, if anything, in terms of waste, it's actually a benefit of nuclear energy, because nuclear energy is the only form of energy which is able to manage its waste. You look at fossil fuels, which Australia predominantly uses in our grid today. People need to consider, where does the waste from that go? Well, it ends up permanently in our atmosphere, and we in Australia breathe it in every single day, and that has consequences. People, unfortunately, die from that due to respiratory issues. That's some waste that does not seem to be a type of waste that we're going to be able to manage. Even the waste from renewables, that ends up in landfill. That's incredibly damaging. And there are predictions of just the sheer volume of that we'll end up with in the future. And you look at a solution like nuclear energy, which is able to safely contain that waste and has an incredibly small volume of waste, which is also able to be reprocessed. I think that's really important to share with the Australian public. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to convey when you've got huge lobby groups which pump out this really emotional, I'd even describe propaganda, which is completely unfactual. And it's really, I would say, difficult to get through that and to convince people. But the thing I would just say is, research it yourself. If you don't believe me, and I don't expect anyone to believe me as a 17-year-old, just do your own research. Have a look at images of nuclear waste. Have a look at, the images of pregnant women hugging the canisters of nuclear waste, or the videos of jet planes, NASA flying. Oh no, that's another example. But in Britain, how they would, put slam trains into the nuclear waste barrels. Have a look for that at yourself, and then make up your mind. Don't just listen to the propaganda and misinformation you've been fed. And I think it's very difficult to convey that to Australians when they've been told to feed nuclear waste, whether it's from things like The Simpsons, but certainly something that I hope I'm able to communicate. I probably need a bit more practice on it to make it a bit more concise, because I have a tendency to overtalk. But I think it's a big issue that we need to overcome here in Australia.
Yeah, and you're obviously very passionate about this and you've learned so much so far. Have you ever had a conversation with someone who was against nuclear and you were able to kind of talk them through it and maybe change their mind a bit?
Well, there's been a few instances, I would say, where that's happened. It's even interesting. And people would be able to see this on my social media, but I was on a national program on our public broadcaster, the ABC, called Q&A, and it's basically a panel discussion show where they get a series of panelists to answer questions of the audience. And we had about 10 minutes on this youth special where I was answering a question and we were all debating as panelists the potential of nuclear energy. And it was interesting to hear after that people verbally exclaimed when I was speaking that somehow I convinced them to support nuclear energy when they didn't support it going into that episode. And I think that's so interesting that just after a few minutes of speaking and sharing facts which they've probably never heard, I was able to convince them, which I was quite astounded by, that there was people in that audience who just from that were willing to support nuclear energy. And there's certainly, a few discussions I've had with people at school where they've come on board with it. I think it's particularly interesting at school because I do debating and stuff, and I'd say a very diverse group of friends in terms of their beliefs and values. But I've received very little pushback for supporting nuclear energy because I think they see what I do, they follow my stuff on social media, and it's very hard to refute the evidence because the evidence is overwhelming that nuclear energy is beneficial. And in that respect, I think the broad assessment I would make is people can see what I'm doing. I'm not misrepresenting anything. I just provide facts. And for that reason, I've had really little pushback. Very few people that I've actually had to convince because, they can make their own mind up based on the content that I provide, which they inevitably do see.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially young people, like you mentioned before, having this clean slate, not having learned about nuclear in school. How do you think that's going to affect the nuclear landscape when, all these young people grow up and they're the people in charge?
Look, I think it's really unfortunate that in the education system in Australia, you're not allowed to discuss nuclear energy. And I think that will have to change due to AUKUS, because clearly we're going to need a lot of skilled young people to be able to take up the roles to serve in our nuclear submarines and to service them. So hopefully that will change to an extent. But I think it's really hard to have any action on nuclear energy when your government's not even willing to educate their citizens about it. That's a huge problem that we've got. And hopefully through my campaign, I'm sort of able to fill a bit of a void by providing young Australians those facts and that information. And, my hope is that that reaches them and that I have enough of a reach to be able to compensate for that deficit currently in the education system.
Yeah, and for people who maybe stumbled upon this interview and now they're looking to learn more, where can they tune into things like Q&A? And they know where they can find you on social media, but what else can they expect to see from you in the near future?
Yes, so I would probably direct them to my website, nuclearforaustralia.com, where they can also sign my petition to legalise nuclear energy at nuclearforaustralia.com/petition. Through there, once they sign the petition, they can sign up for email updates where I'll keep them updated on what I and the other young people working in this organisation are up to and the progress we've made. In terms of from here, what I'm doing, there's a few things, I'm properly trying to establish this campaign because I really want to be able to share this information about nuclear energy and the facts with as many Australians as possible. And I'll be doing that through that website and with the support, hopefully, of people. Also, I'm on another episode of Q&A, which would have just passed it would have just occurred before this recording was aired, where I'll be debating the energy minister, and I'd encourage people to watch that, because it will be my chance to pose my questions and pose what I think is the other side of the story to him and to see his response. So to watch that, people will be able to surely go on our social media, where I'll make sure to share that. And the other thing, at the end of the year, I'm making plans to attend COP28 in Dubai, where I think it's really important that the nuclear movement in Australia has a presence, to show the world that it's not everyone in Australia agrees with the current path the government is taking, and that Australians believe that we should be really open to nuclear energy and have all options on the table. And if you may just give me some time, because Australians do support nuclear energy, poll after poll, and remember, that's the only evidence we have in Australia, because Australians never voted for the ban on nuclear energy. Poll after poll after poll shows that Australians support nuclear energy. In fact, according to one in May this year, 70% of Australians want nuclear energy in order to reach our emissions and energy security targets, and only 18% of Australians identify as anti-nuclear. So based on those statistics alone, surely it's undemocratic to maintain a ban on the technology, when so many Australians not only support the ban being lifted, but actually want nuclear reactors built in this country, which is also quite astounding given the political climate. So I'll hopefully be capitalizing on that support, bringing people around me, and there'll be many more young people also coming on board to support me and what I'm doing. And hopefully we can see the ban on nuclear energy be lifted in Australia, and maybe one day see a pathway for a civil nuclear power reactor being built in this country.
Absolutely. And other than signing your petition, how can people get behind what you're doing?
Well, at the time that this episode is launched, they should also be able to donate to my campaign, Nuclear for Australia, and that will help me share information with more Australians, which is really important, because, like I said early in this interview, once Australians hear the facts, which there's so little facts currently in this debate, they're much more likely to support nuclear energy. And if the government sees that Australians support nuclear energy, and Australians are really powerful and vocal in that support for nuclear, then hopefully we can see some change on that issue.
That's incredible. And is there anything else that we haven't talked about yet that we should before we finally wrap up?
I don't think so, unless you have any more questions.
Let's just leave the listeners with one more message before we go ahead and sign off. Anything you want to say to people that have known about nuclear for a long time, or maybe a listener who's just starting to learn now?
I would say that we need to have all options on the table globally in our energy transition, and we shouldn't just rule out a solution. And you shouldn't just rule out a solution due to your ideological position or what you've been told to think by people. We should have all options on the table. And I think the thing is, you shouldn't get focused on one path. It's not the other thing is, if you support renewables, that doesn't mean that you need to oppose nuclear. And likewise, if you support nuclear, as a result of that, you don't need to oppose renewables. There should be a really pragmatic, holistic view to this energy transition. We shouldn't get haunted in on certain ideas and ways of doing things. I think we need to have all options on the table and really pragmatically approach what is a huge issue for the globe as we transition to net zero.
Awesome. That's a great way to end it. Will, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great to have you and can't wait to see what you do in the future.
Thank you very much for having me on, Sarah.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.